Well, hello. This week's work asks you to kind of step back and take in the big picture, to start thinking in terms of the context that we know literature through and that we know authors through. For reading, what you're asked to accomplish is, essentially, a complete digestion of our textbook by Gray. Now, that may seem a little ambitious, and I agree. Way back when, a month ago now, in my initial observations, I gave some of my thoughts on the way that graduate school tosses huge heaps of textual information at a student. The long and short of it is that we, and by that I mean me as your professor and the professional course designers who have put together LIT502, are quite aware that no one can do justice to the amount of information provided by Gray in just a single going over, not over the course of a couple of weeks. In fact, our module overview points to the truth of the matter when it says that while it would be beneficial to get the widest perspective on American literature, what is practically needed is for you to focus on the perspectives which are, at this instant, applicable to you and your milestone project. So, what I'd like to say is rather than thinking that the object for this week is to kind of come at this in a very half-assed way, what I want you to understand is that this actually represents the way professional scholars work. And by that, I don't mean that professional scholars come at it half-assedly. I mean that they come at it with they come at their work with an agenda. So, for instance, a great book which I heartily recommend is called Antinomies of Realism, and it's by the master critic Frederick Jameson. And it is, I'm not lying, it's good, it's readable, it's fascinating actually. With that said, when I pick up Antinomies of Realism, what I invariably do is sit and pick it apart to see how it sits with my preconceptions of how realism and naturalism fit together in American literature. Essentially, I come at it with a thesis in mind that's based on my experience and my understanding, and I use that for a measuring stick. I look for how what Jameson says can be read to support my beliefs, or I look for spaces where I need to argue with Jameson, or I adjust, or where I need to adjust my own ideas when I find something he says compelling. My point is simply this: I do enjoy reading the criticism, but I also want to get my full use out of it. So I can't help but fall into how it is useful to me, to my work, to my purpose at this time. And you should do likewise with the text by Gray. Now, a fairly important consideration this week is not only history as it relates to literature, but history as it relates to authors, how their contexts shaped them, informed them, and compelled them to write what they wrote. And I wanted to take a few minutes to ask you to think about that. It may seem rather obvious to you that this is a useful thing to do, but for much of the 20th century, it simply wasn't. I'm old enough that when I was an undergraduate, I was taught by professors who learned their craft from the school of the new critics who dominated literary studies during the 20th century. These were guys who swore that the text itself was the only thing that mattered, that if the data was not conveyed to the reader through the words included in the poem or the novel, then it simply didn't matter. This means literally that exploring the history and culture in which an author lived was discounted by these critics as being inconsequential, except where it was overtly, undeniably depicted in writing. So I really just want to note what a real shift has occurred in the short space of my life on what we think is important in talking about literature. Over the past 40 years, a major transition has happened, which puts culture in the forefront of how we think about what literature is doing. And this, in turn, is part of a long arc of thinking about the significance of culture, really, since the Age of Enlightenment. One quick aside on my characterization of what the new critics said versus what they did. So again, I was taught by people who had been taught that the new critics were right. So when they relayed what was happening, they didn't really give us the full picture. They just said, they basically told us what the new critics said and didn't really explain the methods of the new critics. I'm pretty accurate in my summary of how they revered the text, establishing a hierarchy, placing it above the author. With that said, if you pick up A Well-Wrought Urn from 1947 by Cleanth Brooks, he's one of the most important new critics, you'll find that probably about half of what he says about poets like John Donne, Wordsworth, and T.S. Eliot relate to the biography for these authors. The truth is, like everyone, the new critics were products of their training, and while they prioritized the text over supplemental data about the author, they could not quite just let it go because they had been schooled as scholars to revere such data as part of the fullness of the picture. However, the the second generation new critics who wound up teaching me didn't really pass that on. Our professors essentially told us to do as the new critics said and not as they did. And we really came away with a very skewed idea of what the theoretical angle was all about. All this leads me to my own pedagogical focus of always stressing that rounded picture, for looking at things from every which way to really understand it. This week, we have a discussion asking for you to think in big pictures about literary trends and movements. And at the end of the week, I'm looking to see an annotated bib for your milestone project. So consider this an alarm clock. If you have not begun researching in earnest, this is the time to get to it. Start looking at sources, start formulating how they can fit into your viewpoint and your argument. And if you have questions, if you have concerns, if anything is going on, if you want to talk about anything literary, just feel free and contact me. All right. You know how. Till next week, adios.